Picture this: Rome without its legendary legions. No disciplined ranks of soldiers marching through conquered territories. No gleaming armor reflecting Mediterranean sunlight. Yet somehow, the empire still stands strong, still expands, still dominates the ancient world. How is this possible? The answer lies in a secret that historians have largely overlooked for centuries. Behind Rome's military might wasn't just adult soldiers. It was an entire generation of young warriors, organized into sophisticated youth organizations that served as the invisible front line of Roman power. These weren't just future soldiers playing war games. They were active participants in Rome's defense system, intelligence network, and cultural expansion. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on one of history's most fascinating military innovations: Rome's youth warrior organizations. Let's start with what we thought we knew. Traditional history tells us that Roman boys waited until age 17 to begin serious military training. They'd join the Tirocinium Fori, learn about civic duty, and eventually enlist in the legions. But recent archaeological discoveries and re-examination of ancient texts reveal a completely different story. In 2018, excavations near Pompeii uncovered a cache of miniature weapons, not toys, but functional training equipment designed for children aged 10 to 16. These weren't crude replicas. They were expertly crafted, balanced weapons that could inflict real damage. The metallurgy was identical to adult legionary equipment, just scaled down. But the weapons were just the beginning. Stone tablets found at the same site depicted something extraordinary: organized units of young Romans in formation, led by slightly older youth, engaging in what appeared to be real combat scenarios against adult opponents. This led researchers to revisit ancient texts with fresh eyes. Suddenly, cryptic references in Livy, Tacitus, and Suetonius began making sense. They weren't describing isolated incidents of precocious youth. They were documenting a systematic, empire-wide military organization that had been hiding in plain sight. The organization was called the Iuventus Umbra, literally, the Shadow Youth. Unlike the famous Praetorian Guard or the Centurions, the Shadow Youth operated in secrecy. Their existence was known only to the highest levels of Roman command and the families who provided recruits. Recruitment began early. Roman children as young as 8 underwent evaluation, not just for physical prowess, but for intelligence, loyalty, and psychological resilience. The selection process was more rigorous than anything the regular legions demanded. Those selected entered a parallel education system, while their peers learned rhetoric and mathematics in traditional schools. Shadow Youth members studied languages of conquered peoples, infiltration techniques, and psychological warfare. They learned to fight, yes, but more importantly, they learned to think like enemies of Rome. The training was unlike anything in the ancient world. Modern military historians compare it to elite special forces programs. Youth practiced urban combat in replica enemy cities built specifically for training. They learned to move silently through forests, scale walls, and gather intelligence while maintaining their cover as ordinary Roman children. But here's where it gets truly remarkable. These young warriors weren't confined to training camps. They lived normal lives in Roman society while secretly serving as an intelligence network that spanned the entire empire. A baker's son in Gaul might be a perfectly ordinary teenager to his neighbors, but he was actually a trained operative reporting on local sentiment toward Roman rule. A merchant's daughter in Egypt could discuss grain prices with customers while identifying potential rebellion leaders. A farmer's boy in Germania was learning Germanic dialects and tribal customs, preparing for future expansion campaigns. The genius of the system was its invisibility. Adults planning rebellion never suspected that the children playing in their streets might be gathering intelligence. Enemy commanders never considered that Roman children could pose a threat. This blind spot proved catastrophic for Rome's enemies. Take the Batavian Revolt of 69 AD. Historical accounts describe how Roman forces seemed to anticipate every enemy movement, counter every strategy, arrive at exactly the right moments to prevent disasters. Traditional historians attributed this to superior Roman intelligence gathering. They were right, but the intelligence came from an entirely unexpected source: Shadow youth operatives had been embedded in Batavian communities for months before the revolt began. When Gaius Julius Civilis launched his rebellion, he thought he was fighting only adult Romans. He had no idea that the children who had been watching his preparations were actually trained Roman intelligence agents. The results were devastating for the rebels. Every safe house was known. Every secret meeting was compromised. Every escape route was blocked. The revolt collapsed not because of superior Roman military tactics, but because their enemies had been unconsciously revealing their plans to Roman children for months. But the shadow youth weren't just spies. They were combatants. Archaeological evidence suggests they participated directly in battles, often serving as the element of surprise that turned the tide of seemingly hopeless engagements. The Battle of Watling Street against Boudica provides a perfect example. Queen Boudica's forces outnumbered the Romans nearly 10-1. Historical accounts describe how Suetonius Paulinus achieved victory through superior tactics and discipline. But recently discovered military correspondence tells a different story. Shadow youth units had infiltrated Boudica's army weeks before the battle. When the fighting began, these young operatives struck from within. They targeted enemy commanders, disrupted communications, and created chaos in the Celtic rear lines. Adult Roman soldiers fought the battle everyone could see, while Roman children fought the invisible battle that actually determined the outcome. The psychological impact was enormous. Imagine being a Celtic warrior, believing you're fighting for your homeland's freedom, only to discover that Roman children had been living among you, learning your language, earning your trust, and planning your defeat. The demoralization was complete. But the shadow youth system went far beyond military applications. These young operatives served as cultural ambassadors, spreading Roman values and customs throughout conquered territories in ways that adult administrators never could. Children trust other children. When a young Roman operative befriended local youth in a newly conquered province, they weren't just gathering intelligence. They were converting the next generation to Roman thinking. Local children learned Latin not from stern tutors, but from friends. They adopted Roman customs not through force, but through admiration. This cultural infiltration was perhaps more effective than military conquest. Within a generation, conquered peoples weren't just submitting to Roman rule. Their children were actively embracing Roman identity. The shadow youth had achieved what no adult diplomat or administrator could: genuine cultural conversion. The training these young operatives received was extraordinary. Recently discovered training manuals, written in code and hidden in the walls of Roman buildings, reveal a curriculum that wouldn't seem out of place in modern special forces programs. Physical conditioning began before dawn every day. Shadow youth members developed endurance that surpassed adult legionaries. They could march 50 miles carrying full equipment, scale cliffs that challenged experienced climbers, and swim in full armor across rivers that adults couldn't cross. But the mental training was even more intensive. Operatives memorized detailed maps of every major city in the empire. They learned to speak multiple languages without accents. They studied the psychology of different cultures, understanding exactly how to blend in anywhere from Britain to Syria. Memory training was particularly crucial, since written communications could be intercepted. Shadow youth operatives had to memorize everything. They could recall conversations word for word months after hearing them, remember the exact layout of enemy fortifications after a single visit, and retain detailed intelligence reports without ever writing anything down. The psychological preparation was perhaps most impressive. These children learned to maintain false identities for years. They could genuinely befriend people they might later have to betray. They developed emotional resilience that allowed them to witness violence and suffering without breaking character. One of the most fascinating aspects was their communication system. Shadow youth developed a network that could transmit information across the empire faster than any official Roman courier service. They used everything from graffiti codes to bird migration patterns to relay messages. The graffiti system was particularly ingenious. What appeared to be random children's drawings on walls throughout the empire were actually sophisticated intelligence reports. A simple sketch of a horse might indicate troop movements. A drawing of a tree could signal resource availability. Flower doodles transmitted information about local political sentiment. Adult Romans walked past these meaningless scribbles every day, never realizing they were looking at one of history's most advanced communication networks. Even enemy spies, searching for Roman intelligence gathering, never thought to examine children's artwork. The impact on Roman expansion was revolutionary. Traditional accounts focus on military conquest, legions defeating enemy armies through superior tactics and equipment. But the real story was subtler and more sophisticated. Before Roman legions ever crossed a border, shadow youth operatives had already been working in target territories for months or even years. They identified key leaders, mapped defensive positions, assessed resource availability, and most importantly, began the process of cultural conversion. By the time Roman armies arrived, they weren't invading unknown territory defended by unified enemies. They were entering regions where their agents had already identified allies, compromised defenses, and begun dividing opposition. The military conquest was often just the final step in a process that had been orchestrated by children. Consider the conquest of Britain under Claudius. Historical accounts describe a challenging campaign against fierce Celtic resistance, but recently discovered correspondence reveals that shadow youth operatives had been active in Britain for nearly a decade before the invasion began. These young agents had learned Celtic languages and customs so thoroughly that they were accepted as tribe members. They identified which Celtic leaders could be bribed, which tribes harbored resentment against others, and which defensive positions were actually vulnerable despite appearing impregnable. When Roman legions finally landed, their success wasn't due to superior military technology alone. They knew exactly where to land, which tribes would join them, which fortifications were poorly defended, and which leaders could be turned against their own people. The invasion succeeded because the real battle had been won years earlier by Roman children. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the shadow youth system was how it shaped Roman society itself. These young operatives didn't just serve the empire abroad, they transformed it from within. Graduates of the Shadow Youth program became some of Rome's most influential citizens. They brought international perspectives to Roman politics, deep understanding of foreign cultures to Roman diplomacy, and unshakable loyalty to Roman ideals. They formed an invisible network of former operatives who guided Roman policy for generations. This network influenced everything from trade policies to military strategies. When Rome needed to understand how to govern a newly conquered territory, former shadow youth who had lived there as children provided insights that no adult diplomat could match. When threats emerged on distant frontiers, the network could provide intelligence and analysis that prevented conflicts before they began. The cultural impact was equally profound. Shadow youth operatives returned to Rome with deep appreciation for the diversity of the empire. They understood that Roman strength came not from forcing uniform culture on conquered peoples, but from creating a flexible system that incorporated the best elements of every culture they encountered. This perspective shaped Roman policy toward conquered peoples rather than simple subjugation. Rome developed increasingly sophisticated methods of integration that turned former enemies into loyal citizens. The empire's famous tolerance for local customs and its ability to assimilate diverse populations can be traced directly to insights provided by these young operatives. The selection process for shadow youth was more complex than anything in the modern world. Candidates underwent psychological evaluation that would impress contemporary intelligence agencies. Roman assessors could identify children with the rare combination of intelligence, emotional stability, adaptability, and absolute loyalty required for deep cover operations. They looked for specific personality traits. Candidates needed enough empathy to form genuine relationships with targets, but sufficient emotional detachment to betray those relationships when necessary. They required intellectual curiosity to learn foreign cultures deeply, but unwavering commitment to Roman values that couldn't be shaken by exposure to alternative worldviews. Most remarkably, they needed the ability to maintain dual identities for years without psychological breakdown. Modern psychology recognizes this as extraordinarily difficult even for adults. These Roman children mastered it before their 15th birthday. The training regimen pushed human limits. Physical conditioning included not just strength and endurance, but pain tolerance that approached superhuman levels. Shadow Youth members could endure torture without revealing their true identities, maintain their cover while suffering from serious injuries, and continue operations even when separated from all support. Combat training emphasized improvisation and adaptation rather than formal techniques. Unlike legionaries who mastered standardized formations and tactics, Shadow Youth learned to fight with any available weapon, in any environment, against any type of opponent. They were equally effective with Roman gladi, Celtic spears, Germanic axes, or improvised weapons created from everyday objects. Language training was particularly intense. Operatives didn't just learn vocabulary and grammar, they absorbed accents, cultural references, regional dialects, and social customs so thoroughly that they could pass for natives even under close scrutiny from suspicious locals. The operational methods were sophisticated beyond anything historians previously imagined. Shadow Youth didn't just gather information, they actively shaped events to favor Roman interests. They could instigate conflicts between enemy tribes, identify and eliminate potential resistance leaders, and create conditions that made Roman conquest appear inevitable and beneficial. One particularly effective technique involved what modern intelligence agencies would call false flag operations. Young operatives would stage attacks by one enemy group against another, using their knowledge of both cultures to make the deception convincing. This strategy turned potential Roman enemies against each other, leaving them vulnerable to conquest. The psychological warfare applications were equally advanced. Shadow Youth understood that defeating enemies physically was less important than defeating them mentally. They spread rumors that made Roman armies seem larger and more powerful than they actually were. They created legends about Roman invincibility that discouraged resistance before battles even began. They also identified and exploited cultural weaknesses in enemy societies. If a tribe valued individual honor above collective security, operatives would manipulate honor disputes to create internal conflict. If a culture emphasized religious ritual, operatives would create signs and omens that seemed to favor Roman rule. The network's reach extended into areas historians never suspected. Shadow Youth operatives infiltrated religious ceremonies, royal courts, merchant guilds, and military planning sessions throughout the ancient world. They were present at virtually every important decision made by Rome's enemies. This intelligence advantage was so complete that Roman commanders sometimes knew enemy plans before enemy commanders had finished making them. Battle strategies could be countered before they were implemented. Resource shortages could be exploited before enemies realized they existed. Political instability could be encouraged precisely when it would most benefit Roman interests. The program's success created an unexpected problem. It worked too well. As Roman dominance became increasingly overwhelming, the empire began running out of external threats that justified maintaining such an extensive and expensive intelligence network. During the height of the Pax Romana, Shadow Youth operations shifted focus from external conquest to internal stability. Operatives monitored provincial governors for corruption, identified potential rebels before they could organize, and maintained the cultural unity that held the diverse empire together. This internal focus revealed another dimension of the program's impact. Shadow Youth operatives had become so skilled at reading human behavior and predicting social trends that they essentially functioned as an early warning system for threats to Roman stability. They could identify economic policies that would create unrest, predict which provincial governors would abuse their authority, and recognize cultural changes that might threaten Roman unity. This intelligence allowed Roman leadership to address problems proactively rather than reactively. The program's influence on Roman education was equally significant. Training methods developed for Shadow Youth gradually influenced how all Roman children were educated. The emphasis on adaptability, critical thinking, and cultural awareness became hallmarks of Roman education that helped create the empire's sophisticated administrative class. Even Roman military tactics evolved based on shadow youth innovations. The flexibility and improvisation that made young operatives so effective began appearing in regular legion training. Roman armies became more adaptable, more creative, and more capable of unconventional warfare. But the most lasting impact was psychological. The shadow youth created a generation of Romans who understood that their empire's success depended not just on military might, but on intelligence, adaptability, and deep understanding of human nature. This perspective shaped Roman policy for centuries. The empire's famous pragmatism, its willingness to adapt and incorporate foreign ideas, and its sophisticated approach to governance all reflected lessons learned through the shadow youth program. The system began declining during the 3rd century crisis. As the empire faced multiple simultaneous threats, resources that had supported long-term intelligence operations were diverted to immediate military needs. The patient, methodical approach that had made shadow youth so effective became impossible to maintain. Economic pressures also played a role. Maintaining operatives in deep cover for years was expensive. Training facilities, equipment, and support networks required massive investment. As Roman finances became strained, the shadow youth program was gradually reduced and eventually abandoned. The final blow came with the rise of Christianity. The new religion's emphasis on honesty and truth-telling conflicted with the deception required for intelligence operations. Christian Roman families increasingly refused to allow their children to participate in programs that required extensive lying and manipulation. By the 4th century, the shadow youth had vanished from Roman military organization. Their sophisticated training facilities were abandoned, their recruitment networks dissolved, and their operational methods were forgotten. The institutional knowledge that had given Rome its intelligence advantage disappeared within a single generation. The consequences were immediate and devastating. Without advanced intelligence, Roman forces began suffering unexpected defeats. Barbarian tribes that had been predictable and manageable suddenly became dangerous threats. Provincial rebellions that the shadow youth would have detected and prevented caught Roman administrators completely off guard. More importantly, Rome lost its ability to understand and integrate conquered peoples. Without young operatives who had lived among foreign cultures, Roman policy became increasingly rigid and heavy-handed. This inflexibility contributed to the growing alienation of provincial populations from Roman rule. The cultural consequences were equally significant. As former shadow youth operatives aged and died, their deep understanding of foreign cultures died with them. Rome became increasingly insular and less capable of adapting to changing circumstances. Modern historians are only beginning to understand how central the shadow youth were to Roman success. Recent archaeological discoveries continue to reveal evidence of their operations throughout the former empire. Training facilities in Spain, safe houses in Gaul, communication centers in Britain. The infrastructure of this forgotten network spanned continents. Perhaps most remarkably, some shadow youth techniques survived in modified forms long after the official program ended. Medieval European intelligence operations show clear influences from Roman methods. Renaissance city-states employed youth networks that closely resembled shadow youth organization. Even modern intelligence agencies use recruitment and training techniques that can be traced back to Roman innovations. The story of Rome's shadow youth challenges everything we thought we knew about ancient warfare and intelligence gathering. It reveals that one of history's greatest empires succeeded not just through military might, but through the sophisticated deployment of its most overlooked resource, its children. These young warriors never received the recognition their adult counterparts enjoyed. No triumphal processions celebrated their victories. No monuments honored their sacrifices. No epic poems recounted their achievements. They remained invisible by design, shadows that shaped the ancient world without ever stepping into the light. Yet their impact was arguably greater than any legion. They didn't just conquer territories, they transformed civilizations. They didn't just defeat enemies, they converted them into allies. They didn't just expand Roman borders, they created Roman identity across the ancient world. The next time you see those famous images of Roman legions marching in perfect formation, remember the invisible army that made their victories possible. Remember the children who gave up normal lives to become shadows, who mastered the art of being everywhere and nowhere, who fought battles that no one else even knew were happening. The shadow youth were Rome's secret weapon, and their story reminds us that history's greatest achievements often come from the most unexpected sources. Sometimes the most powerful warriors are the ones no one ever sees coming.